What if I told you that we've been farming gear incorrectly the entire time since release? Ladies, gentlemen, and Rajam of all ages, Diablo 4 has been playable for over 3 weeks now, and while the main grind that most people have been taking part in so far is the journey to level 100, as of course that feels like a pretty awesome thing to achieve, lots of people have spent this time just hunting down specific legendary aspects and uniques to create the builds that they want to use, right? A lot of farming nightmare dungeons are finding specific dungeons with big packs of elites so you can just mow them down and reset for a bunch of fast drops in limited time, or even actually Helltide, a very much intentional endgame system designed for farming gear in specific slots. But what if I told you there was a way to essentially apply the logic of Helltides, which is hunting specific slots of gear, to the game as a whole? What if I told you there was one type of enemy that has about 5 times the chance to drop Shaco than any other enemy in the game? And what if I told you that applied to the vast majority of gear types in Diablo 4? This is something that a lot of people may well have known at one point, but have since forgotten about that it was a thing, as it was briefly mentioned a very long time ago at a panel while Diablo 4 was under development. But every enemy type in the game essentially has boosted drop chances for specific types of items, meaning that they are about 5 times as likely to drop those items than any other enemy type is. And because of this, you can use that to target specific dungeons to farm if you are after something more particular than just legendaries or uniques as a general concept. On top of that, if you can target specific nightmare dungeons that are dense with these enemies, you can get higher chances of ancestral drops of those very specific items too, which not only lets you fill in your weaker gear slots, but also lets you target very specific uniques if you want to. Today we're going to talk all about monster families in Diablo 4. And no, I'm not talking about baby goat men being brought up into a world that is harsh and unforgiving under the watchful eyes of their goat parents. I'm talking about these specific types of monsters in Diablo 4, and what major differences they have as far as loot drops, and of course we will talk about the dungeons that are the most dense places to farm these enemy types if you want the loot that they drop more often. First up then are bandits, which I will be using as a main example here. Bandits have a 5 times increased drop rate on daggers and one-handed maces, meaning if you kill a bandit and it drops an item, that item is 5 times more likely to be a dagger or a mace than any other type of item in the game. That as a concept should already tell you this is actually incredibly important information to pay attention to. Of course, bandits can drop other things, and they do, but they are far more likely to drop one of those. That means if you are after a dagger or a mace, or even more specifically if you're playing rogue for example and you want the unique daggers, you should be specifically hunting down bandits. There is another enemy type that has enhanced dagger drop rate, but they also have enhanced helmet drop rate. So if you specifically want daggers, you should focus bandits as a rogue in the first place, because you have lowered drop rate on maces because you can't wield them. With that said, as this video is specifically about the best ways to target farm uniques, I also recommend doing this in nightmare dungeons whenever possible, as again, these actually have higher rates of ancestral drops as well with the tier 4 ones, and higher rates of sacred drops in tier 3, which combos really nice you with the targeted slot farming to both give you better quality gear in general, but also more chances at the specific uniques that you want. That said, where is the best nightmare dungeon to farm bandits as an enemy type? Currently it is one of 2 places, which are MAULWOOD, which is just a nice densely packed dungeon with bandits in both objective areas, though not as the main enemy type, or secondarily, you have RENEGADE'S Retreat. There is a much higher portion of bandits here than other enemy types, but the dungeon itself is much less densely packed, which means that it's a slower farm for bandits specifically. That said, those are the 2 main nightmare dungeons to farm if you are after daggers or maces specifically, but in case you don't have those specific sigils but still want to use this farming method, the other nightmare dungeons with some population of bandits are MAUGAN'S Works and also RAETHWIND Wilds. After that, we have the beast category of enemies. This includes things like the big tree enemies, bears, as well as thorned beasts, the charging boars, and also werewolves and wargs. They are mostly around in Skull's Glen more than anywhere else, and their increased drop chance applies specifically to chest pieces, crossbows, and one-handed swords. If you are hunting for one of those 3 item types, these are some of the best enemies to farm in general, as they have that lovely 5 times increased drop chances for them. And so let's talk about the best places to farm them. The best far and above anything else is the ALDURWOOD dungeon. This is a nicely dense place that is just full of nothing but beast type enemies. They are all beast types, werewolves, porcupines, boars, just filled to the brim with all of them, making it a pretty much perfect beast farming area. And it is a dungeon that just has one objective and then a boss, so you can clear it out relatively quickly too, making it just perfect for farming repeatably. Again, Nightmare Dungeon, if you have it, is ideal for this. They just have higher drop rates on sacred gear for tier 1 to 20 and ancestral gear for tier tier 21 and above. If you do not have sigils for Elderwood, the second and third best for farming beast-type enemies is Farrell's Den, which is also in Skull's Glen, as well as Whispering Pines, which again is in Skull's Glen. Third up then are the cannibal enemies.
I'm gonna eat y'all. I'm gonna eat that hairy leg.
This is a very self-explanatory enemy type. They are the more barbaric humanoid enemies that you will come across in the game. Their increased drop chance is specifically for two-handed axes, one-handed axes, and also helmets. So let's say that you're after the Ancient's Oath Barbarian Unique two-handed axe, or even the Waxing Gibbous Druid one-handed axe. These would be the best enemy that you can farm for these because of their enhanced drop rate on this item type. As far as nightmare dungeons to farm for these, there are actually only a couple of nightmare dungeons in the game currently that even have this enemy type within them, and the better one by far is the Earthen Wound, especially as in general this is a densely packed dungeon to begin with. In the first objective, the cannibals will mostly be centered around the gates that you have to break down, and in the second objective they are just sort of around the place in general. The other nightmare dungeon that has cannibals but isn't anywhere close to as good is Gulron Slums. It's not a terrible dungeon, but it just has a big mix of enemy types, so if you are trying to specifically farm cannibals, it's nowhere close to as good as Earthen Wound. After that, we have the cultist enemies. Their enhanced drop rates give them a 5 times average chance to drop both daggers as well as helmets. If, for example, you are farming for Shaco, the Harlequin's Crest legendary is the only thing you want, these are a super solid enemy to farm for them. However, it's worth noting we now have full confirmation that your enemies have to be level 85 or higher for Shaco to actually even have a drop chance. But this place is the best for it if you're there, especially because cultists only have 2 enhanced drop rate chances, being the daggers and the helmets. And if you are a class that can't use daggers, you have a lower drop rate of those to begin with, so you should just get far more helmets from cultists than anything else. So if unique drops from a cultist, it has a 5 times greater chance of being a unique helmet than any other unique, which is the essence of target farming like this. As far as where to find these pesky rascals, the best place by a mile is, as you might guess, the Cultist Refuge dungeon in the Fractured Peaks. It is literally named Cultist Refuge, so of course it's just absolutely full of cultists. The first objective in this dungeon is literally nothing but cultists, and the second objective, having cultists as the main enemy type, but there's also some werewolves and wargs too. So top to bottom, this place is crawling with cultists, which makes it the best perfect farming location for helms, and one of the best ones for daggers as well. The only other nightmare dungeon capable location that is really even relevant is actually Conclave in Kyrgyzstan, but it is far less densely packed than Cultist Refuge. After that, we have the drowned enemy type, and they have a 5 times increased drop rate on scythes for necromancers, two-handed maces, pants, and also boots, which is a lot of slots to have increased rates for. The sad part about these guys though is they actually don't have a nightmare dungeon they are even really a part of, which means that you can't double up the increased drop rate of ancestrals from nightmares. If you want to target farm the drowned enemy type though, you essentially just have to stick to overworld content or standard normal dungeons. The best one of those though that you can do for it is actually Ruins of Eridu in Hawazar. This is a well-known experience farm dungeon that did get nerfed pretty hard recently, but the nerfs did not change the fact that this is just the most densely packed location of drowned enemies just in the game. So again, if you are trying to target any of those equipment types, this is absolutely the place to do it in, especially as no other monster family has an enhanced drop rate for those item types either. Next up are the Fallen enemy.
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
These are the type of impish demons that are all over the place really, and their enhanced 5 times drop rate is for one-handed axes and also for staves. So again, if you are after one of those, these are a good enemy type to farm. If you are after one-handed axes specifically, this is arguably better than farming cannibals too, as they only have an enhanced drop rate on 2 item types rather than 3 like cannibals. So by process of elimination, the chance of one-handed axes dropping is simply higher to this enemy type, even though they both have enhanced drop rates for axes. As well, the staves that they drop are Druid specific staves, not sorcerer staves, Druid staves. As far as where to farm them, there is one exceptional nightmare dungeon full of them, which is Demon's Wake. Both objectives here have Fallen as the main enemy type within, and it is decently densely packed with them as well, with the second objective even being Slay all enemies, which are Fallen, and the boss at the end even counting as a Fallen as well. This place is just exceptional for farming Fallen. There isn't really any other nightmare dungeons with a Fallen as a common type enemy, so if you don't have a sigil for this dungeon but still want to farm farm Fallen, essentially just do the normal version of Demon's Wake, which will give you less results, but still really great Fallen density. Then let's talk about the Ghost monster type. Again, pretty self-explanatory. These are the ghosts, the green ghosts, the red ghosts. They're all ghosts, and they have a 5 times normal drop rate on bows and wands specifically, which is of course relevant to both rogues and sorcerers. As far as actually farming these enemy types, the best Nightmare dungeon to use is actually Earthen Wound. Again, there is a nearly equal amount of ghost to cannibal ratio within this dungeon, and it has the most densely packed number of ghost enemies of any Nightmare dungeon in current rotation for the game. So this location is quite good for this enemy type as well. The next best one, though, is the Lost Archives dungeon in the Fractured Peaks, though this one has the red ghosts instead of the green ghosts, and the red ghosts are just a slightly more annoying enemy type to deal with, so the green ghosts are definitely much nicer. After that are the Goatmen enemy type, which have a 5 times enhanced drop rate on specifically two-handed axes, one-handed axes, two-handed staves, which are the Sorcerer staffs specifically, and then also totems for specifically Druids. As far as specific ways to farm this enemy type, there is only one Nightmare dungeon in the current rotation that has them, but it has quite a hell of a lot of them, and that is Champion's Demise. This place has always been great for farming in general, even after the nerfs. The actual rate of item drops in here is still quite high, so if you want one of those types of items, it is still a really great place to go. If you don't have any sigils for Champion's Demise and still want to farm it, even without Nightmare's increased drop quality, it's actually still pretty good for it, but you can instead also do something like Hoarfrost Demise in the Fractured Peaks, which is just a really nice, short, densely packed with Goatmen dungeon in general. Next up are the skeleton enemies, which of course includes any skeleton type in the game, and these have a 5 times drop rate on crossbows, shields, and one-handed swords. So if you're after any of those, these are the enemies to farm. As far as where to go to do it, there are 2 pretty solid Nightmare dungeons with dense amounts of skeletons. The first one is Black Asylum in the Fractured Peaks, and the other one is also in the Fractured Peaks, which is Dragon Barracks. Neither one of these has skeletons as their primary enemy type, but actually no dungeon in the game actually does, so these are still the best places for that, especially as Nightmare dungeons. Then we have the Snakes and Serpentine type enemies that inhabit the Hawazar region. These have a 5 times enhanced drop rate on two-handed polearms and one-handed swords. They aren't the only one with enhanced sword drop rate, but they are the only one with enhanced polearm drop rate, so if you're specifically after a polearm, this is definitely the enemy to hunt. As far as where to find the densest packs of snake enemies in Nightmare dungeons, there are 2 really solid ones. The first one, far and away, is the Serpent's Lair dungeon. This is just full of these enemy types and full of elites too, which even further ups your drop rate, so again, a great place to go for this. The other pretty good Nightmare dungeon for this in particular is actually Witchwater. This dungeon is super fast to clear, decently densely packed, and is majoritarily filled with snake type enemies, which makes it another really top tier snake farming location. After that, we have the spider type enemies, which is any and all spiders, as well as the spider hosts that explode into a bunch of spiders when you kill them. They have an enhanced drop rate on chest pieces, focuses for Sorcerer and Necro, gloves, and two-handed swords. This is the only enemy type with that 5 times bonus drop chance for focuses and for gloves, so if you want one of those 2 item types, these are absolutely what you should be fighting. Not to mention, generally speaking, spider type enemies are great for experience too, as they tend to be very densely packed, so there's that as well. As far as the best Nightmare dungeons with these enemies to farm to give you a higher ancestral drop rate as well, the best one is without a doubt the Blind Burrows. This is a well-known farm location in the game just in general. The enemies you can find in most of this are by far and away just the spider family enemies, which makes this just an impeccable location to farm them all. A really high tier secondary option though is actually the Abandoned Mineworks in Kyrgyzstan, which also has spiders as the main enemy type through the entire dungeon, so both of these will work, but Blind Burrows is just a fair bit denser and more efficient to run as well. Then finally, the last enemy type in the game is actually vampires. These can be a little bit annoying, often including the enemy type that turns into bats and teleports around a lot, but the bright side about this is that vampires have a 5 times increased drop rate on two-handed swords, bows, and wands, all of which also have enhanced drop rates from other enemy types, so you never actually have to farm vampires specifically if you don't want to, because there are other monster types that drop those items just as frequently. That said, for completion's sake, if you do want to farm a Nightmare dungeon with vampires specifically, the best one is again Dragon Barracks in the Fractured Peaks. If you don't have a sigil for that dungeon and still want to farm vampires, just do the normal version of that dungeon. Yeah, it will have lower ancestral drop rates, but there just isn't another good Nightmare dungeon for vampires specifically. And that's everything, every enemy type in the game, which items they have a beautiful 5 times increased drop rate for, which Nightmare dungeon contain each enemy type in large amounts so you can farm those item slots for ancestral gear, even letting you target farm specific legendaries and uniques as a result. Sadly, none of the monster types give you enhanced drop chances for rings or amulets at all, so if you're after any of those, you actually have to just do it the old-fashioned way. But for everything else, there's at least one way, one specific type of enemy that you can just kill absolutely loads of on repeat for a higher chance at the item of your dreams. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown, and I hope it helps you out in your journey through Diablo 4, as this information can only really make your life easier, not harder in the slightest. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.